Week 11, the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was a movement that spanned the early 1900s dedicated to the cultural, social, and artistic contributions of African Americans in Harlem, a New York district that was once exclusively white but became an African American neighborhood in the early 1900s. During this period, Harlem became a cultural center drawing Black writers, artists, musicians, photographers, poets, and scholars. W.e.b. Du Bois, a significant figure for his pursuit of social justice, encouraged artists to leave the South with its oppressive caste system in order to find a place where they could freely express their talents. The Harlem Renaissance was more than just a literary movement. It involved racial pride, fueled in part by the militancy of the new Negro demanding civil and political rights. The new Negro represented the idea that blacks could challenge the pervading racism and stereotypes through intellect and the production of literature, art, and music to promote more progressive politics and social integration. In other words, they used art to prove their humanity in demand for equality. The movement was also known for incorporating music like jazz and the blues, which brought in whites as well, who would dance together with the blacks. The movement developed out of the many changes that had taken place in the African American community since the abolition of slavery in 1865. Blacks during this time still struggled to develop an identity. Even though they were considered free, they still lacked many of the opportunities that whites had. Forced to live under the supposed separate but equal Jim Crow laws, blacks still faced many racial challenges in the United States. Though the Harlem Renaissance may have contributed to a certain relaxation of racial attitudes among whites, it still had little impact on breaking down the rigid barriers that separated the races. However, it did succeed in laying the foundation for the civil rights movement in the mid-20th century. One of the major writers of the Harlem Renaissance was Claude McKay. Born in Jamaica, McKay came to America in 1912 to study agriculture. His 1922 book of poetry entitled Harlem Shadows is generally considered the book that initiated the Harlem Renaissance. His poetry, much of it written in strict sonnet form, braided racial subject matter, radical politics, and poetic technique into compelling statements that were also good poetry according to traditional standards. Zora Neale Hurston was raised in an all-black town in Eatonville, Florida, and was therefore protected from racism at an early age. After the death of her mother, whom she was very close to, Hurston began to pursue an education, bringing her all the way to Howard University in Washington, D.C., the nation's leading African American university at that time. After successfully publishing a short story in a New York magazine, Hurston decided to move to Harlem and pursue a literary career. Here she became known as a great storyteller who focused on oral narrative. Hurston's work was not entirely popular with the male intellectual leaders of the Harlem community. She rejected the idea that black writers' chief concern should be how blacks were being portrayed to the white reader. She did not write to uplift her race, as some Harlem writers did, because in her view it was already uplifted. She, like Claude McKay, was not embarrassed to present her characters as mixtures of good and bad, strong and weak. Some of the other Harlem writers thought her either naive or egotistical, but Hurston argued that freedom could only mean freedom from all coercion, no matter what the source. Langston Hughes was the most popular and versatile of the many writers connected with the Harlem Renaissance. Like Hurston, he wanted to capture the oral traditions of black culture in written form. His first volume of poems, The Weary Blues, was published in 1926. The Great Depression brought an abrupt end to much African American literary activity, but Hughes remained a public figure throughout the rest of his life. Also considered a modernist, Hughes chose to focus his work on modern urban black life. He modeled his stanza forms on the rhythms of jazz music and adapted the vocabulary of everyday black speech to poetry. For this week's discussion, consider the following. How do this week's readings demonstrate ideas of racial pride? Be sure to use examples from all three writers.